Picture this. You've been saving diligently for years, tucking money away every month, doing everything right, watching the number in your account slowly climb. And then, without spending a single dollar of it, without making one bad decision, you wake up 1 year later and that same pile of savings buys you roughly half of what it used to. Not because you touched it, not because you gambled it on some risky stock, just because the ground underneath it quietly shifted while you were looking the other way. Honestly, I used to think inflation was one of those dry, textbook words, a boring little line item economists argue about on cable news. And then I started actually digging into what happened to regular families in Turkey over the last several years, and it kind of rearranged how seriously I take this stuff. Because this isn't some abstract, theoretical scenario. This happened to millions of real people, teachers, shop owners, retirees, who did everything they were taught to do and still watched their savings quietly evaporate. Here's what I want to walk you through today, because I think it's genuinely one of the more important stories in modern economics, not just as history, but as a warning label. Understanding exactly how Turkey's currency crisis unfolded and why it happened teaches you something most people never think about until it's too late. That the currency your savings sit in isn't a neutral, boring detail. It's a decision. And decisions like that can either protect you or quietly wipe you out. So let's get into it. What a currency crisis actually means. Let's start simple, because this term gets thrown around a lot without anyone really explaining it. A currency crisis is basically what happens when a country's money rapidly and dramatically loses value, both against other currencies and in terms of what it can actually buy at home. It's not just the exchange rate went down a bit. It's more like the floor giving way underneath an entire economy at once. Here's the simple version of the mechanism. If a currency's value collapses, everything the country imports, fuel, food, raw materials, electronics, suddenly costs way more in local currency terms, even though nothing about the actual product changed. That price increase ripples through the whole economy. Bread costs more, rent costs more. Basically, life costs more seemingly overnight, while your paycheck, or your savings, stays exactly where it was. That gap, between prices racing upward and your money staying flat, is where people's financial security quietly gets crushed. Why should you care about this, sitting wherever you are right now? Because most of us assume the currency we save in is just fixed, stable, a given. Turkey's experience is a pretty stark reminder that it's not a given anywhere. It's a policy choice, made by people, and those choices have consequences that land squarely on regular households. The first crack, 2018, the first major shock hit in the summer of 2018. A diplomatic dispute between Turkey and the United States escalated sharply, and as tensions rose, investor confidence in the Turkish economy took a serious hit. In August alone, the lira dropped roughly a quarter of its value against the dollar. Just in that 1 month. I think about this kind of event almost like a crack forming in a windshield. It doesn't shatter everything instantly, but it tells you something structural underneath was already stressed. Turkey had been running large deficits and leaning heavily on foreign borrowing for years, which made its currency unusually sensitive to a shock like this. The 2018 episode wasn't the full disaster, it was the warning shot. And, like most warning shots, it mostly got treated as a one-off crisis to survive, rather than a signal to fundamentally change course. The takeaway here is almost uncomfortably simple. Economies that depend heavily on foreign money flowing in are fragile in a specific, predictable way. When confidence dips, even briefly, the currency can move fast. If you're ever evaluating where to hold savings, that vulnerability, how dependent an economy is on outside capital, is worth understanding, not ignoring. The bigger blow, 2021 and the interest rate gamble. Here's where the story gets genuinely dramatic, and honestly a little hard to believe if you didn't watch it happen in real time. Conventional economics has a pretty well-established playbook. When inflation rises too fast, central banks typically raise interest rates to cool things down, because higher rates make borrowing more expensive and saving more attractive, which slows spending and eases price pressure. Turkey's leadership took the opposite approach. There was a strongly held belief at the top that high interest rates actually cause inflation, rather than cure it, which runs against how most of the world's central banks operate. So even as inflation climbed toward the high 30s by the end of 2021, the central bank cut interest rates several times in just a few months. Lower rates, rising prices, at the exact same time. It's a bit like flooring the gas pedal while insisting you're braking. The result was about what you'd expect if you understand the mechanism. The lira lost close to half its value against the dollar over the course of that single year. Savings that Turkish families had built up over years, money set aside for a child's education, a wedding, retirement, kept the same number on the bank statement, but the actual purchasing power behind that number kept shrinking, week after week. This matters because it's the clearest possible illustration of a concept that sounds abstract until it isn't. The difference between the number in your account and what that number can actually buy. What it looked like for actual people. This is the part that, honestly, is hard to fully capture in numbers alone. But let's try. Inflation eventually climbed past 70% at its peak. Imagine budgeting your monthly groceries, and by the time next year rolls around, that same grocery list costs nearly double, while your income adjusts far more slowly, if at all. That's not a hypothetical. That was daily life for a huge portion of the country. Families responded the way people naturally do when they stop trusting their own currency. They scrambled to convert savings into something that wouldn't evaporate. Gold, foreign currency, especially dollars and euros, even everyday consumer goods, bought early, before prices climbed again. It's the financial equivalent of grabbing sandbags before a flood. Not because you want to hoard goods, but because holding on to cash suddenly feels like holding on to something melting in your hands. Here's why this should land for you personally, wherever you live. This is a real-world demonstration of why financial advisors talk so much about diversification, and not just across stocks and bonds, across currencies too, especially if you live somewhere with a history of instability. Watching an entire country instinctively shift toward gold and hard currency isn't superstition. It's rational behavior under a currency you can no longer trust to hold its value. The course correction and the long road back. To its credit, Turkey's economic leadership eventually shifted direction. Starting around mid-2023, a new economic team moved back toward more conventional policy, raising interest rates aggressively, from single digits up into the 40s by the end of that year, specifically to rebuild confidence and slow inflation down. It was, essentially, an admission that the earlier experiment hadn't worked the way it was supposed to. And it's helped, gradually. Inflation has cooled from those brutal 70% peaks, though as of the past year or so, it's still running well above 30%, meaning prices are still climbing meaningfully faster than most people's incomes, just not at the earlier breakneck pace. The lira, meanwhile, has continued, a slow, managed slide rather than the sudden freefalls of 2018 and 2021. I find this part almost more instructive than the crisis itself, honestly. Recovery from something like this isn't a light switch. It's slow, uneven, and it asks an enormous amount of patience from people who've already lost a lot. The takeaway for you is this: trust in a currency, once broken, doesn't rebuild quickly. It takes years of consistent, credible policy to earn that trust back, which is exactly why preventing this kind of spiral matters so much more than fixing it after the fact. The lesson underneath all of it. So what do you actually take from all this? Sitting comfortably wherever you are, probably not worrying about your currency collapsing overnight. A few things, and I think they're genuinely worth carrying with you. First, purchasing power, not the number on your statement, is the thing that actually matters. Always ask what your money can buy, not just what it says. Second, concentrating all your savings in a single currency, especially one with a history of instability, carries real risk, even if it feels boring and safe day to day. And third, when interest rate policy stops making conventional sense, that's usually not a quirky detail to shrug off. It's often the earliest visible sign of trouble underneath. Bringing it home. So, Turkey's currency crisis isn't just a distant foreign headline. It's a genuinely human story about millions of people who saved responsibly, trusted the system they were handed, and still watched their financial security quietly slip through their fingers because of decisions made far above their heads. That's not meant to scare you. It's meant to sharpen how you think about your own money, wherever in the world you happen to keep it. The honest, hopeful part of this story is that people adapted. They found ways to protect what they'd built, through gold, through diversification, through simply paying closer attention than they used to. And that, more than anything, is the real invitation here. Not panic, not doom-scrolling headlines about the next currency in trouble, just a quiet nudge to actually understand what's backing your savings, today, before life ever forces you to learn it the hard way.